I want to start with a bridge. Not a famous one. Not the Golden Gate, not Tower Bridge, nothing you'd put on a postcard. I want to start with a bridge that almost nobody photographs, that tour guides don't mention, that sits in a provincial corner of Eastern Europe with no plaque explaining what it is or how old it is or why exactly it was built the way it was built. I'm standing above the Drina River in Serbia, and the bridge I'm looking at is wider than the road that leads to it. Considerably wider. By modern standards, by any standard of practical engineering, a bridge is built to serve a road. The road dictates the width. The bridge accommodates. That's how it works. That's how it has always worked. Except here it didn't. Here the bridge is the main event. The road, narrow, route, barely wide enough for two carts, arrives at the bridge's edge like an afterthought, like something that was added later, like something built to connect to a structure that was already there, already standing, already waiting for a purpose that never fully arrived. That was the first anomaly. It wouldn't be the last. The deeper I went into this subject, the more I realized I had been asking the wrong question. For years, researchers in what you might loosely call the alternative history community, and I use that term without judgment because some of them are meticulous, have been cataloging structures, buildings, mostly the grand civic architecture of the 19th century. If you've spent any time in these circles, you know the basics. The theory proposes that before the modern era, there existed a civilization of significant reach and sophistication that has been largely written out of conventional historical narratives. Some call it Tartaria, drawing from old maps that labeled vast regions of Asia as Tartary or Grand Tartary. The mud flood theory extends this, suggesting that parts of an earlier civilization were buried beneath what we now consider the surface of history. I was skeptical. I remained skeptical. But I kept coming back to the bridges because if there was a prior civilization, if there was a lost infrastructure, a forgotten system of roads and waterways and movement, then bridges would be the tell. Bridges are commitment. You don't build a bridge speculatively. You build a bridge because there is traffic, because there is weight, because there is purpose on both sides. And the water between them is a problem worth solving at enormous expense and effort. So if the bridges don't match the roads, if the bridges are wider, older, stranger than the systems they ostensibly serve, then what were they serving? Let me be precise about what I mean by wrong size, because this is where the official explanation starts to wobble in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Famous Starry Mouse. The old bridge was, according to official history, built by the Ottoman architect Mimar Hayuddin in 1557. It is a single-arch stone bridge of extraordinary elegance spanning the Neretva River at a width of roughly 4 m. This matches the narrow cobblestone lanes of the old city. It is, in conventional terms, correctly proportioned. Now travel north. Travel to the bridges of the Habsburg territories, Hungary, Bohemia, Galatia. Here you find something different. Here you find bridges, particularly in smaller provincial towns, that seem grotesquely oversized for their context. The bridge at Český Krumlov, spanning the Vert in a small Czech town of no particular strategic or commercial significance in the medieval period, features roadbeds that some researchers have measured at nearly twice the width required by any documented historical traffic. This raises a simple but critical question. Who commissioned it? For what purpose? And crucially, where are the records? Because here is something that strikes me every time I look into one of these structures. The documentation disappears. Not completely, not in ways that prove anything. But the gap is there. The earliest detailed municipal records for many of these structures begin in the mid to late 1800s. The period, coincidentally, that Tartaria theorists identify as the post-reset reconstruction era. The period when a new civilization was supposedly cataloging and repurposing what it had inherited. Not inventing, inheriting. That word matters. I want to talk about foundations because this is where I first understood that I wasn't just looking at an architectural curiosity. I was looking at something that the official historical record has significant difficulty explaining. Standard bridge construction, from Roman aqueducts to medieval fortifications to 18th century infrastructure, follows a logic. The deeper the water, the harder the current, the more significant the span, the deeper and broader your foundations must be. You anchor, you dig, you pile drive, you create stability in the earth that will absorb the enormous lateral and vertical forces a bridge must bear. There is a category of bridges scattered across Central and Eastern Europe and into parts of Russia and the former Tartary territories that appear to violate this principle in ways that engineers when pressed struggle to explain with period-appropriate technology. The bridges in question sit on footings that appear on inspection and in the few architectural surveys that have been conducted to be extraordinarily shallow given their span and load-bearing demands. Some researchers examining photographs of flood-damaged bridges in the Ural region have noted that exposed foundations appear to extend barely a meter below the riverbed for bridges of that width and mass. For bridges that have stood for what official records claim is 2 to 3 centuries. Consider the Alcantara Bridge in Spain. 6 stone arches spanning the Tagus River, rising 48 m at its highest point. Officially Roman, officially dated to 106 AD, it has survived 2,000 years of floods, earthquakes, and wars. When engineers examine its foundations, the depth and hydraulic engineering present in the piers belong to a tradition of precision that the period's documented methods struggle to account for. And yet, there it stands. And here's the strangest part. They're still standing. Something built incorrectly by the engineering standards we're told applied at the time that has been standing for 300 years. Not every bridge, not even most bridges, but enough to form a pattern. Enough to ask, what if they weren't built with period-appropriate technology? What if the technology was different, better, or simply other? I want to pause on something that sounds at first like the most sensationalized part of this inquiry. I want to talk about celestial alignment in bridge architecture because when I first encountered this claim that certain historic bridges appear to be oriented not along the natural path of the rivers they cross but along astronomical sightlines, I dismissed it. It sounded like the kind of thing you find on poorly cited websites at 2 in the morning. It sounded like apophenia patterns seeking in the noise. But then I started looking at the actual orientations, and this is where it becomes impossible to ignore. In a number of cases across Western and Central Europe, bridges that carry no obvious strategic alignment that cross rivers at angles that appear from a purely practical standpoint. Unnecessarily oblique turn out when their central axis is extended on a map to point towards specific solar or astronomical markers. Sunrise and sunset positions at solstices, the rising point of particular stars, angles that match within tolerances consistent with deliberate design, what archoastronomers have documented in megalithic and pre-Roman structures. The bridge at Regensburg in Germany, one of the oldest intact medieval bridges in Europe, officially dated to 1146 AD, sits at an orientation that has drawn comment from researchers interested in sacred geography. When extended, its axis points toward a specific horizon position associated with solar events. Coincidence? Possibly. The Charles Bridge in Prague compounds the suspicion. Construction supposedly began on July 9, 1357 at exactly 5:31 a.m., a moment chosen by royal astrologers to produce a numerical palindrome in the date. Historians present this as medieval superstition. But the bridge itself runs along an east-west orientation aligned with the equinox sunrise and sunset, its towers framing the sun at solstices with a precision that goes well beyond numerological theater. But the pattern repeats not once, not twice. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across structures officially attributed to different builders, different centuries, different cultures. The Kaju Bridge in Isfahan incorporates pavilions and water channels positioned to reflect moonlight at specific lunar phases. The ancient bridges of Angkor in Cambodia orient toward temple complexes that themselves align with stellar constellations. These are not decorative accidents, which asks a question that mainstream archaeology has never satisfactorily answered about medieval Europe's builders. Did they inherit a surveying system, a grid, a set of reference points already embedded in the landscape that they were building along rather than inventing? As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. The bridges lead somewhere. They have to. That's the premise of a bridge. You cross the obstacle, the river, the gorge, the ravine, and on the other side there is a destination, a road, a city, a trade route. Except sometimes there isn't. And this, for me, is where the anomaly becomes genuinely arresting. There is a documented phenomenon discussed in municipal heritage surveys noted in passing by local historians and absolutely never integrated into a coherent national historical narrative of bridges in small European and Central Asian towns that lead to roads that simply terminate. Roads that begin at the far end of a bridge travel several hundred meters and stop not at a building, not at a historical site, not at anything. They stop in a field or in a neighborhood whose street grid demonstrably postdates the bridge itself, arranged as if he built around an access point whose original destination had been erased, leading to nothing. There are bridges that go further than nothing, that go in fact nowhere at all. The Rot Bridge in Germany spans a narrow artificial lake between two sections of parkland, connecting paths that lead to no town, no trade route, no destination of any obvious practical value. It is a perfect stone arch, and I mean geometrically perfect, forming a complete circle when reflected in the water below, built with foundation depth that far exceeds any structural requirement for so small a crossing. Official history calls it ornamental, but ornament does not explain the engineering. You do not over-engineer decoration. Now the conventional explanation, and there is one, is that these are remnants of road networks that were abandoned, rooted or disrupted by war, plague, or economic collapse. Perfectly reasonable. Medieval and early modern Europe experienced all of those things in abundance. But here is where the official explanation collapses, or at least bends. If a road was rezooted, if a bridge's original purpose was redirected by a known historical event, there should be records. There should be a charter, a municipal order, a survey, a letter, something explaining that the old road to wherever was closed in year X because of reason Y, and that the new road now goes here instead. These records exist abundantly for deliberate road construction, for canal routing, for city planning, for the bridges leading nowhere. The records are almost universally absent. The silence was deafening, not inconclusive, not ambiguous, absent. The explanation exists in no document I have been able to locate. The bridges simply predated whatever came after them, and no one at any point in the documented history of these regions thought to explain why. I want to step back now. I want to take the 30,000-foot view because I think that's where the argument for something genuinely anomalous in our historical record becomes hardest to dismiss. Take everything I've described. The oversized bridges in provincial towns, the shallow foundations bearing impossible loads, the astronomical alignments replicated across cultures and centuries, the roads terminating in emptiness, the missing documentation. Now ask yourself, how do you produce that pattern by accident? Because here is the coordination problem. If you accept the official history, if you accept that these bridges were built by the cultures and in the periods attributed to them, then you have to explain how a 12th century German master builder and a 16th century Ottoman architect and an anonymous 17th century provincial engineer in Bohemia all independently arrived at the same orientation logic, the same proportional anomalies, the same relationship to a landscape that appears in retrospect to have been preserved. Not similar, not roughly comparable, geometrically consistent across languages, across empires, across centuries of supposed discontinuity, wars, plagues, conquests, cultural erasers. How? That's the question. Not why, not when, not under which architect's supervision. No, how? How do you get geometric consistency across 1,000 miles and 300 years without a common source, without a shared system, without at minimum a set of reference points that all of these builders had access to and none of them thought to mention? The evidence suggests something much larger than any individual architectural tradition. It suggests an inheritance, a substrate, something that was already there. I keep returning to the maps. The maps of Tartary, and they were called Tartar or Tartaria explicitly, and without apparent irony, on European topographic documents from the 16th through early 18th centuries depict a territory of enormous extent. Grand Tartary covers most of northern and central Asia. Chinese Tartary covers the east. Independent Tartary occupies what is now Central Asia and parts of Siberia. A Muscovite Tartary, this is the one that interests me most, sits in what is now Western Russia, adjacent to and sometimes overlapping with the territories we associate with the emerging Russian state. These were not marginal labels. Gum Deal, one of the most respected topographers of the early 18th century, labeled these territories with the same authority he applied to France or the Holy Roman Empire. They appear in the maps of Herman Moll, of John Speed, of Alexis Burt-Geo. They are consistent across topographic traditions that were otherwise highly competitive and often contradictory. And then they stop. By the late 18th century, by the Enlightenment era, by the period of modern surveying and statecraft, the label Tartar or Tartaria has largely vanished, replaced, absorbed into Russia, into the Qing Empire, into categories that fit the emerging political and imperial frameworks of European power. This is not by itself evidence of a hidden civilization. Topographic labels change. Political entities are absorbed. Names shift. But here is what stays with me. The bridges I've been describing, the anomalously wide ones, the improbably shallow ones, the astronomically aligned ones, are disproportionately concentrated in the territories that those old maps labeled Tartary or in territories immediately adjacent to them, or in the westward F-facing margins of European civilization, where historians have long acknowledged cultural influence from the east arrived in waves that we still don't fully understand. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The bridges are not randomly distributed. They cluster. They cluster in ways that, when overlaid on the old Tartarian maps, produce a geographic coherence that the conventional historical narrative simply doesn't account for. Let me dwell for a moment on what these bridges actually required to build, because I think this is the piece of the puzzle that deserves more serious attention than it typically receives, even within alternative history circles which tend to focus on the visual and the architectural rather than the engineering. A single arch stone bridge of significant span, say 40 m, requires an enormous temporary wooden scaffold called a centering to be erected in the river, around which the stone arch is constructed. The centering must be precisely engineered to bear the weight of the stone as it is placed and then removed or collapsed at exactly the right moment when the arch becomes self-supporting. This is a highly technical procedure. It requires an understanding of compressive forces, of material tolerances, of geometric precision. Now, who taught that to the builders of the 12th century? The conventional answer is Roman precedent. That Roman engineering knowledge was preserved imperfectly, partially, but sufficiently through the early medieval period and informed the builders of Romanesque and Gothic structures. Possible. But notice what the answer requires. It requires an unbroken chain of transmitted knowledge through the period we call the Dark Ages. The period roughly from the fall of Rome in the 5th century to the Carolingian Renaissance, during which literacy collapsed, urban infrastructure decayed, and the sophisticated administrative systems that had produced Roman engineering largely ceased to function. That's a thin thread. A very thin thread for transmitting highly technical knowledge across 5 centuries of fragmentation. Unless the knowledge wasn't transmitted verbally. Unless it wasn't transmitted through documents or through living masters and apprentices. Unless it was transmitted through the structures themselves. Unless a new civilization arriving at or emerging from the ruins of a prior one read the existing structures, the bridges, the aqueducts, the roads as its textbook learned by copying what it found rather than by understanding why it worked, as if following instructions they didn't fully understand. I want to address the hardest part of this hypothesis directly. The part that makes serious researchers uncomfortable. The part that I find, despite my resistance, increasingly difficult to set aside. The Tartaria theorists, the most rigorous among them, proposed that at some point in the relatively recent past, perhaps the early to mid-19th century, a civilization scale event occurred. Something that disrupted the existing order. Something that left the built infrastructure in place, but removed or destroyed or deliberately obscured the population and records that could explain it. The mud flood hypothesis suggests a literal burial, sediment, water, catastrophic geological or meteorological events that layered meters of material over the lower floors of existing structures. And there is photographic evidence from the early Gerotype era onward of buildings across European and American cities with ground floors that appear to be below street level. First floor windows half submerged. Staircases that descend to doors now underground. Buildings that seem to have been entered originally from a level that is no longer the ground level. Not water damage, not slow erosion, not decades of gradual buildup, but meters of material quickly, decisively. And then this is the critical element: the subsequent civilization cataloged what it found. The World's Fairs of the late 19th century, which alternative history researchers have analyzed at length, appear to feature architecture of impossible sophistication for their officially credited construction timelines. Buildings of extraordinary scale, built in months by workforces whose logistics are poorly documented in styles that demonstrate an architectural fluency inconsistent with the surrounding urban fabric. Were they built or were they revealed? I don't know. I want to be honest with you. I don't know. But the question refuses to leave me alone. I started with a bridge. I'll end with one. There is a bridge in a small town in the Ural region. I won't name it because the researchers who documented it asked that I not, for reasons that say something about the current climate around these inquiries, that leads from one bank of a river to the other. The road on the western bank is modern tarmac built in the Soviet era. The road on the eastern bank is gravel, a single lane leading to a stand of birch trees and then nothing. The bridge itself is stone, old stone, the kind of worn, dark Lyanco-covered stone that takes centuries to acquire that particular texture. It is wider than any road in that town. It is wider than any road within 40 kilometers of that town. And at its center on the upstream parapet, there is a carved motif, a solar symbol, not Christian, not Islamic, not consistent with any of the folk traditions documented in that region. Something older, something that appears when compared to similar motifs documented on structures in Bohemia, in Hungary, in Uzbekistan to belong to a shared visual vocabulary. A grammar of symbol that no known cultural tradition of the region claims as its own. Someone built that bridge. Someone decided it should be that wide, that it should sit at that angle to the river, that it should carry that symbol. Someone had a reason. And somewhere between then and now, the reason was lost or buried or quietly set aside. The deeper I go into this, the more I suspect the question isn't whether a prior civilization existed. Advanced civilizations have always existed, risen and fallen. The question is whether the infrastructure they left behind, the roads, the aqueducts, the bridges, was correctly attributed or quietly absorbed into a historical narrative that couldn't accommodate its true origin. The question is who inherited all of this and whether they knew it. The question is what they chose to tell us and what they didn't. The bridges are still there, wider than the roads, older than the cities, pointing at angles we don't fully understand, toward destinations we can no longer see. They were built for something. They were built for a world we no longer remember. And until we are honest about what we don't know, until we are willing to sit with the gap between the official record and the physical evidence, we will keep walking across them without asking where they came from or where once they were meant to lead.